The room glowed in soft gold and muted white chandeliers, glinting off cut crystal as the din of polite laughter and silverware blended into Charleston's finest version of admiration. Arlyn Keswick stood quietly by the coat check, adjusting the hem of her simple navy dress, a practical, wrinkle-resistant choice that neither impressed nor offended. All around her the women sparkled, sleek hair, floor-length gowns, statement heels. The kind of room where introductions included not just names, but degrees, titles, and the Ivy League lineage of one's children. She knew the script by now. "Celia," someone called. The crowd around the entrance parted, and there she was. Celia Keswick, neurosurgeon, keynote speaker, and recipient of the Southeastern Women in Medicine Excellence Award. Her hair was perfect, swept into a bun that looked effortless, but certainly wasn't. She wore a black silk gown with an asymmetrical neckline and a string of pearls their grandmother had left to Arlyn, though Arlyn had never contested its disappearance. Irene, their mother, trailed just behind her, beaming. Gregory, their father, adjusted his bow tie as he greeted a man from the medical board. "There she is," Irene announced, proudly loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "The woman of the hour. My daughter, the doctor." Arlyn hovered near a marble column, watching. Irene leaned in toward a pair of women she clearly wanted to impress. "That's Celia Keswick. You've probably seen her on the news. She pioneered a new approach in minimally invasive spine repair, absolutely brilliant. Both your daughters in medicine?" one of them asked with a pleasant smile. "Oh no," Irene said with a chuckle that made Arlyn wince. "Arlyn, she's consulting or freelancing. We're not really sure these days." The women smiled politely and turned their attention back to Celia. Arlyn blinked her gaze steady, the rest of her frozen. The sting wasn't sharp, more like the soft ache of an old scar when rain hits. A server passed with champagne. Arlyn took one more for something to do with her hands than the drink itself. She let the glass touch her lips but didn't sip. She scanned the name cards arranged on the gold-framed seating chart. Table 6. She followed the path of numbers and linen until she found it at the far end of the ballroom near the catering doors. Not with family. Not with Celia's colleagues. Just close enough to hear the applause, too far to join the conversation. She sat down quietly. At her table, a podiatrist and her teenage daughter, a retired dentist, and his talkative wife, and a local florist, who seemed thrilled to be surrounded by real professionals. No one asked who Arlyn was. Her phone buzzed. A single text lit the screen. "Wesley Drohan? Thinking of you, You deserve a room that knows who you are." She exhaled softly. Wesley never said much, but he always said the right thing. One of the guests at her table asked if she was there with one of the honorees. Arlyn smiled. "Just family." The keynote began. A brief montage of Celia's career played on the projection screens flanking the stage, surgery clips, patient testimonials, and appearance on a morning show. The crowd clapped enthusiastically. Then the MC called her name. Celia rose gracefully, all smiles and practiced humility, and made her way to the podium. "Thank you for this honor," she began. "I owe so much to my incredible team, my mentors, and of course my family, my parents, Gregory and Irene Keswick, who believed in me from day one. Their standards shaped me. Their encouragement made all of this possible." Applause, camera flashes, and to my little sister Arlyn Celia, added glancing briefly toward the back of the room whose curiosity always made me ask better questions growing up. Arlyn stiffened. The words were technically kind, but the tone offhanded. A footnote. Celia continued her speech, fluent and poised. She joked about residency, told a story about nearly passing out in her first surgery, and made a moving appeal for more women in leadership roles. Arlyn watched as the audience leaned in, laughed, nodded. Celia had always known how to occupy a room. She never once tripped over a word or seemed unsure of herself. At the end, the room rose in a standing ovation. Arlyn did not. She remained seated at table 6, surrounded by napkin rings and dessert menus, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Celia's eyes scanned the room as she stepped down from the podium. They reached the back, paused, and landed briefly on Arlyn. For a second, just a second, it looked like she might come over. But she didn't. Celia turned, smiled at a board member, and disappeared into the knot of admirers surrounding the stage. Arlyn sat back in her chair, the echoes of applause still ringing in her ears, and lifted her untouched champagne to her lips. She sipped, slowly, tasting nothing. Celia's name had always come first, in conversations, in introductions, in mail. The Keswick girls, people would say then, immediately turned to Celia for confirmation, forgetting Arlyn was standing beside her. It wasn't malicious, not really. It was just the natural gravity of things. Celia sparkled. She had always known where she was going, and she brought others along in her glow. Arlyn, on the other hand, had spent most of her childhood in the quiet corners of rooms, notebooks balanced on her knees, recording the world as it passed her by. Their mother, Irene, insisted on structure. Piano lessons for both girls, ballet on Saturdays, tennis in the summers. Celia excelled at all three. Arlyn tolerated them. When Arlyn quit ballet at age 8, saying she didn't like being watched, Irene frowned as if she'd said she didn't believe in hygiene. "You need poise," she'd said. "Discipline. Look at your sister." Celia had just won a regional dance award and been featured in a glossy insert in the local paper. Arlyn had drawn a comic strip about spacefaring sisters and taped it to the refrigerator where it lived for half a day before being replaced by Celia's Certificate of Achievement. By middle school, the contrast had become its own kind of ritual. Celia won the science fair. Arlyn lost herself in books about code breaking. Celia became president of the student council. Arlyn joined the library advisory board, which no one in the family believed was real. Celia spoke fluently, performed well, embodied the kind of excellence that could be summarized neatly in holiday letters. Arlyn asked too many questions and rarely gave anyone a clear answer about what she wanted to do. Gregory, their father, took a particular interest in Arlyn's future when she turned 16. A man of systems and strategy, he approached parenting the way he approached trial prep, organized, goal-oriented, and unconcerned with feelings. The world rewards clarity, he'd say, and pedigree. He started leaving LSAT prep books in the den, not so subtly nudging her toward law. "You have a sharp mind," he told her once, over dinner cutting into a porterhouse. "You could do very well if you applied it to something concrete. Something real." Irene, ever the voice of aspirational decorum, had a different vision. "You'd make a lovely doctor. You're careful and observant. We could finally have a surgeon and a psychiatrist in the family." When Arlyn told her she didn't like blood, Irene just waved a hand. "That's all training. Besides, you're too smart to waste on, what was it again? Communications." "It's linguistics," Arlyn had said. "Behavioral linguistics?" Gregory raised an eyebrow. "So, what does that mean exactly?" she tried to explain. "Patterns in speech, subconscious linguistic cues, the way people say things when they're lying, when they're afraid, when they're hiding something, how language reflects power and intention." She was barely a sentence in when he cut her off with a sigh. "That's not a real career, Arlyn. That's something people dabble in before they find what they're really going to do." The family motto was unspoken but ironclad. If you can't explain it in one sentence, it's not respectable. By college, Arlyn had stopped trying to translate her interests into something her parents could understand. She went to a state university, majored in linguistics, added psychology, and quietly applied to graduate programs that focused on forensic communication. When she got a fellowship in Washington, D.C. to work with a government-funded research group analyzing criminal interrogations, she called home to share the news. Gregory asked, "So is this like a legal thing?" Irene asked. "Are you going to be safe?" Celia texted, "Sounds niche." "You always did like weird stuff." Arlyn thanked them, hung up, and didn't bother explaining further. She moved to D.C. and built a career that didn't fit neatly into any box. She worked with federal agencies first as a research analyst, then as a contract specialist for the DOJ's Behavioral Profiling Division. She sat in on interviews, read thousands of transcripts, identified speech anomalies and psychological inconsistencies that no AI system could catch. Her reports helped shape cases that toppled corporate schemes, exposed domestic terror cells, and redirected investigations before they went public. But the nature of the work required discretion. She couldn't tell her family what she was working on. She couldn't even tell some of her friends. And over time, she grew used to letting them believe she was doing freelance analysis or whatever vague label sounded safest. The truth required context, and context had never been the Keswick family's strong suit. Celia's world remained one of metrics and trophies. She became a neurosurgeon, moved into a condo with floor-to-ceiling windows, dated another doctor and then another, and was profiled in a glossy magazine with the headline, "Precision with a Smile." She looked perfect in scrubs. Arlyn looked like background noise. Every holiday gathering followed the same rhythm. Celia would share updates about surgeries and conferences and new surgical tools she helped design. Irene would beam. Gregory would ask questions. Arlyn would sip wine quietly, then go out to the porch to breathe. Once over Thanksgiving, Gregory asked her if she had thought about getting a teaching license to stabilize things a bit. Arlyn said no. She liked her work. Sure, he replied. But don't you want something with a little more legitimacy? That word echoed long after the dishes were cleared. Legitimacy, as if her whole life was an impersonation of one. She had learned to compartmentalize. Her world, the real one, where she worked on active cases and carried clearance credentials, existed entirely separate from the version her family believed in. It was easier that way, simpler. The lie required no maintenance because no one ever asked follow-up questions. And yet, some part of her had still come to that gala dinner, still walked into that ballroom and let them seat her at the edge as if she were lucky to be there at all. Maybe part of her still wanted to be seen, not just in passing, but fully, clearly, and maybe that was the real reason she hadn't left during the toast, because part of her, against all logic, was still hoping that Celia would look into the crowd and see her. Not the sister who didn't become a doctor, not the one who never settled down, not the mystery guest at table 6, but her, the other daughter. Arlyn had once spent 7 consecutive days in a windowless federal facility reviewing a single man's voice. His name was redacted from most documents. She only knew him as Subject 41. He was a low-level contractor in a defense consulting firm who had suddenly started taking meetings with the wrong people. The Department of Justice suspected a leak, and somewhere in the stack of internal compliance interviews, someone thought he was hiding something. Her job wasn't to catch him in the act. It was to listen for the way he hesitated between answers, the shift in pronoun use when questions got personal, the minor but mounting linguistic shifts that suggested concealment. She hadn't seen his face, just audio and transcripts. No courtroom, no badge, no gavel. Her tools were headphones, a legal pad, and a fading lamp in a sub-basement office 2 blocks from the Capitol. She drank cheap coffee and ate dry protein bars, and at the end of it all, her summary report was 15 pages of quietly damning detail. They called it preliminary support material. That preliminary support material helped uncover a web of political kickbacks tied to military infrastructure contracts. 2 senators stepped down quietly. 3 indictments were filed without press release. Subject 41 accepted a plea deal. Arlyn got a curt thank you email from a DOJ liaison and a warning that her report, like all materials tied to that investigation, would remain sealed indefinitely. She would never be allowed to reference it on her resume. The case didn't exist publicly. It simply ended. She had moved on to the next project like she always did. There was always another transcript to review, another threat assessment to complete. And no one in her family ever asked what she'd been doing during those long months in D.C. When she missed Celia's engagement party because she was sitting in on a high-priority debrief for Homeland Security, Irene called her selfish. Celia texted, "Not surprised. At least you're consistent." No one asked what had kept her away. They never asked. It made it easier, in a way, easier to stay behind the glass. Arlyn had long ago accepted that her world didn't translate well into holiday conversations. It wasn't impressive in the way that surgeries or court wins were. There was no white coat, no courtroom, no photos or titles, just sealed documents and long silences. She didn't mind the anonymity. Most days, it suited her. It gave her room to observe, to record. She was better at noticing than performing. But Lately, the division had started to feel heavier. It wasn't just that her family didn't understand what she did. It was that they never seemed to think it mattered. In the days leading up to the gala, she debated whether to go at all. When the invitation arrived in an embossed envelope with the Charleston Society of Medical Advancement printed across the top, she almost tossed it. But something made her hold on to it, maybe obligation, maybe habit, maybe a thin strand of hope she hadn't yet been able to cut loose. The afternoon of the event, she sat in her apartment with the closet doors open, staring at a line of dresses that all felt like camouflage. She pulled out a black sheath dress she hadn't worn in 3 years. It had no sequins, no embellishments, no dramatic cutouts, just clean lines and a high neckline. It whispered professional without shouting anything else. Simple is safest, she thought, holding it up to the mirror. Her phone buzzed. A notification from a secure app coded and nameless. One of her active reports had been flagged for follow-up. She glanced at the timestamp. She had a half-hour window before she needed to leave for the gala. She opened her laptop, skimmed the flagged portions. A domestic surveillance transcript from North Carolina. The subject's tone had shifted, more formal, less self-referential. A distancing pattern. Classic markers of a premeditated alibi being constructed. She made a note, added 2 lines to her ongoing behavior log. Then she closed the file, encrypted the drive, and slid it into the safe bolted behind her bookshelf. Locked it. Powered down. Took a breath. No one at the gala would care about any of it. No one would understand that even in a plain black dress, she carried classified intel between her ribs like second lungs, that she read people, not for gossip, but for survival. That sometimes the smallest pauses said the loudest things. They would look at her, sitting at the far table holding a glass of wine, and see someone with no real job, someone who couldn't quite get it together, who never became a doctor, who never married, who never showed up for the family in the way they had decided mattered. She could already hear Irene explaining to someone in the buffet line Arlyn's doing some kind of consulting, language-related, I think, but not teaching, not anything with tenure. Celia would nod and smile and turn the conversation back to her newest clinical trial or the new condo renovation or the fellowship she had just been asked to judge. And Arlyn would let them, like always. She took the dress to the steamer, ran it gently, letting the heat smooth out the travel lines, picked out a pair of small earrings, nothing that sparkled too loudly. As she reached for her shoes, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Wesley Drohan. You going tonight? She hesitated, then typed, yes. Apparently, I still enjoy being mildly tortured. A beat. Then, you still have more poise than any of them. She smiled, just briefly. Wesley had a way of reminding her who she was underneath all the silence. She slipped on her shoes, checked the mirror once, then grabbed her coat. She was still behind the glass, but maybe tonight the reflection would shift. Even if only for a moment. By the time the waitstaff began clearing salad plates and resetting for the entree, Arlyn had already cataloged every exit in the ballroom and counted 5 different guests who had referred to Celia as a national treasure. The wine flowed liberally. The clinking of glasses and delicate laughter echoed under the chandeliers like an expensive kind of static. Arlyn nodded politely as the podiatrist at her table launched into a detailed story about plantar fasciitis, smiling with the vague attentiveness of someone who wasn't really there. A soft chime from the sound system signaled the start of formal remarks. Gregory Keswick rose from the head table, his posture perfectly squared, one hand still resting lightly on his wine glass, like a man used to holding a courtroom with a single gesture. Good evening, he began, and the room quieted. As many of you know, I'm Celia's father. And tonight I have the immeasurable honor of not only watching my daughter be recognized for her accomplishments, but of reminding us all what it means to pursue excellence with grace. He turned, slightly offering a rehearsed smile to Celia, who sat poised beside their mother. Her hands folded neatly in her lap expression, the perfect mix of humility and anticipation. From the time she was a little girl, Gregory continued, Celia showed a kind of focus that can't be taught. I remember her asking for anatomy textbooks at age 11. While other kids were worried about school dances, she was reading about cranial nerves. The audience chuckled warmly. Arlyn lowered her eyes to her lap. She has spent her entire life building something extraordinary, he said. And tonight, we celebrate not just her talent, but her discipline, her relentless curiosity, her heart. A small swell of applause rose. Arlyn clapped twice, then stopped. Gregory gestured toward the audience. We live in a world that often celebrates noise, he said. Viral moments, shortcuts, flashy distractions. But Celia reminds us that there is still power in mastery, in commitment, in being the kind of person who doesn't need to advertise their worth because it shows in every life she touches. Irene stood a napkin still draped over her forearm like a sash. Both of our daughters are wonderful. She added loud enough to be heard without the microphone, but only one made something of herself. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Light, harmless. The kind of laughter that polished people deploy when they aren't sure if they're supposed to laugh, but don't want to be the one who didn't. Arlyn stared down at her hands, her thumbnail pressing a crescent into the side of her finger. Her heart didn't race. This wasn't new. It wasn't even especially cutting, just familiar, like the background noise of a life. The dentist next to her chuckled into his whine. What is it you do again? He asked. Something in translation? She looked up, surprised by how genuine he sounded. No sarcasm, just a vague curiosity, like someone wondering whether you'd visited Michigan in the fall. She smiled. Not wide, just enough. Something like that, she said. Mostly pattern recognition, behavioral analysis. Oh, like body language? Not exactly. He nodded, clearly losing interest. Sounds neat, he offered, and turned back to his wife. Arlyn folded her napkin, set it on the table, and stood. She moved carefully, weaving through the tables, smiling at no one. No one stopped her. She passed a waiter holding a tray of stuffed mushrooms and paused at the side exit leading into the hallway. The hallway was quiet, dimmer. A relief. She stepped into the shadows between two large floral arrangements and leaned back against the cool wall. Her fingers found the chain around her neck, plain silver, a gift from herself after her first solo DOJ contract. The door creaked slightly behind her. She didn't turn around. The footsteps were soft, deliberate. Celia's voice reached her before she did. You always disappear during the best part, she said. Arlyn turned slowly. Celia stood a few feet away, her silhouette elegant, even in the dim light. Her award pin still glinted on her dress. I needed air, Arlyn said. You needed distance, Celia replied. Arlyn shrugged. Maybe both. Celia studied her for a moment. Do you even want to be here? Does it matter? You could have said no. I almost did. Celia leaned against the opposite wall. For a moment, they stood facing each other, two versions of the same nameplate, raised in different fonts. You're good at hiding, Arlyn Celia said, voice low. Always have been? Even as kids, you'd vanish into a book or behind a camera or into whatever thing you were dissecting that week. Arlyn didn't answer. But hiding, Celia continued, isn't the same as showing up. That landed harder than Arlyn expected. Not because it was mean Celia wasn't trying to be cruel. It was the kind of thing she believed about the world that presence meant performance. That being seen was proof of worth. I show up, Arlyn said finally. Just not in the ways you think count. Celia tilted her head slightly. You could explain it, what you do. Help people understand. They don't want to understand, Arlyn said. They want confirmation that I've failed in a way they recognize. Celia's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes flickered. Maybe recognition. Maybe guilt. Maybe just a shadow of both. I meant what I said in the speech, she added. About you making me ask better questions. Arlyn gave a small laugh. You didn't mean it for me. Celia looked down. Maybe not. A beat of silence passed between them. Not empty, just full of too many years, too many assumptions, too many missed chances. I don't need to be seen by the room, Arlyn said, but it'd be nice not to be erased. Celia nodded slowly, as if cataloging the words for later examination. Then she pushed off the wall. You coming back in? Arlyn glanced toward the ballroom where the lights still shimmered and the music had resumed between courses. "I think I'll stay out here a little longer," she said. Celia didn't press her, just offered a small nod, the same one she gave her surgical residents when they got something almost right. Then she disappeared back into the noise. Arlyn leaned against the wall again, closing her eyes. Hiding wasn't the same as showing up, but sometimes showing up meant standing just outside the frame and refusing to flinch. Arlyn lingered in the hallway long after Celia was gone, watching the soft glow of the ballroom spill through the cracked door like artificial sunlight. She could hear the murmur of renewed conversation silverware against porcelain, a burst of laughter that didn't belong to anyone she cared about. Her wine glass was still on the table at table 6, probably cleared by now, as forgettable as she was in that room. She leaned her head back against the wall, closed her eyes, and let the quiet settle around her like armor. There had been moments, too many, really, when she'd almost said something. Thanksgiving, 3 years ago, for example, when Gregory cornered her near the fireplace and asked if she'd considered going back to school for something more concrete. She could have told him then that she was working a live case with the DOJ, that her reports were feeding directly into a counterintelligence investigation involving active national security threats. But instead she smiled and said, "I'm happy where I am." Another time it was Irene who pushed. Over coffee, her mother had sighed dramatically and said, "I just want to be able to tell people what it is you do, Arlyn. Something that makes sense. I feel like I'm lying when I say you're in analysis." Arlyn had stirred her coffee and said, "That's close enough." They weren't ready to listen. And she wasn't ready to explain. Because explaining meant opening a door she wasn't sure would ever close again. It meant exposing the real weight of what she carried. And the truth was, her family wasn't just uninterested. They were deeply committed to not knowing. She remembered the day she met Wesley Drohan. It was supposed to be a temporary assignment, 2 weeks reviewing internal transcripts from a flagged informant inside Homeland Security. The informant had gone dark. The Bureau suspected he was playing both sides, and someone needed to comb through months of interview footage to detect discrepancies. Wesley had raised an eyebrow when she walked into the conference room, young, soft-spoken, wearing no badge or gun. "You're the profiler," he'd asked. "Not the kind you're thinking of," she replied. 3 days in, she spotted it. A slight shift in verb, tense, and unusual evasion pattern, a false memory planted intentionally. The informant had memorized a narrative and repeated it too precisely, but one reflexive pronoun out of place had cracked the facade. She traced it through 5 different transcripts, connected his vocabulary to a pattern seen in foreign operatives trained to mimic domestic speech. The guy wasn't just lying. He was trained to lie. Wesley had called her into his office late one night. "You just blew open something I've been circling for months," he said. "That report you wrote, it's going straight to counterintel. This changes everything." 2 weeks turned into 6 months. She briefed senior agents. She got fast-tracked for a higher clearance. And eventually she was asked to consult on sensitive operations with interagency overlap. The kind of work no one talked about outside the room. She went home that Christmas to find Gregory bragging about Celia's appearance on a podcast about medical breakthroughs. Irene had printed out Celia's headshot from the hospital's website and taped it to the refrigerator. No one asked what Arlyn had been doing. She didn't offer. What would she say anyway? "I helped expose a trained mole inside Homeland Security while you were buying tickets to Celia's TEDx talk." There was no graceful way to insert yourself into a family mythology that didn't have a place for you. Over the years, she learned to compartmentalize. Her work became a kind of sacred space, closed off, untouchable safe. No birthday dinners, no judgment, no diminishing size. But some nights, when the glow of her laptop screen was the only light in the room and her report was due before dawn, she would wonder what it might feel like to have someone, just one person, truly see her. Not for what she could have been if she'd gone into law, not for what she should have been if she'd followed her mother's blueprint, but for what she was, a quiet operator in a noisy world, someone who noticed the subtle things, the things that didn't shout but still mattered. She had power, just not the kind they valued. Still, the silence wore on her. It coated every dinner, every housework with a layer of dishonesty. Not because she was hiding, but because they weren't listening. Now, standing alone in a hallway filled with hydrangeas and piped-in jazz, Arlyn felt the weight of all the words she hadn't said. The missed chances, the swallowed truths, the endless performance of being tolerable. She looked down at her phone. A new text from Wesley had come in time-stamped just after Celia's toast. "Wesley Drohan, how's the circus? You still invisible? Or did they notice the woman holding the tent up?" She stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then, finally, she typed back, "Still behind the curtain, but I'm starting to think about pulling it down." She didn't hit send. Not yet. But she left the hallway with the thought tucked behind her ribs like a matchstick. Maybe silence had protected her for years, but it had never set her free. The entree had just been served pan-seared halibut with lemon beurre blanc plated over a bed of wild rice no one had requested, but everyone politely accepted. The crowd buzzed with the kind of post-toast release that comes after a long evening of speeches and staged applause. Celia sat radiant at the head table bouquet of white lilies and pink peonies propped beside her like a scepter. Someone had just made a joke about her next award being from NASA, and Irene laughed as if it were prophecy. Arlyn sat at table 6, 2 glasses of wine in her posture, relaxed in the way that came from choosing detachment over engagement. The halibut was fine. The conversation at her table had shifted to Charleston real estate and someone's recent renovation nightmare. Arlyn nodded, smiled occasionally, but mostly drifted. She let her mind idle. She thought briefly of the surveillance case she'd flagged last week, the subject with the too smooth answers and inconsistent verb structures. She still needed to write that summary report by Monday. Her fingers itched to start it even now, even here. The work never really left her. It lived somewhere just under the surface, waiting for the quiet moments to speak. She reached for her wine, swirling what remained in the glass. The chatter around her blurred into a low hum, then a sound, not sharp, just different, intentional. The ballroom's double doors, tall and carved with inlaid gold, opened in complete silence, but their movement was enough to pull focus. The air seemed to shift. Forks paused mid-air. Heads turned. A man entered, framed by the soft uplighting from the hallway. Not tall, but commanding, clean-shaven, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored with quiet precision. He carried no papers, no briefcase, just presence. Arlyn's stomach tightened before her brain caught up. Judge Leland Marsh, United States District Court, Eastern Division, federal bench for over 25 years. She hadn't seen him since the internal debrief 7 months ago. What the hell was he doing here? There was a moment of collective confusion. The crowd looked toward the podium, toward the MC, toward Celia, whose expression shifted just slightly, curiosity blending with expectation. He must be here for her. Another award. A surprise announcement. But Judge Marsh didn't head for the stage. He walked past the head table, past Irene, past Gregory, whose eyebrows furrowed in polite confusion. He walked straight toward table 6. Arlyn's table. Her. He stopped in front of her chair and, without hesitation, extended his hand. "Ms. Keswick," he said, voice clear, deliberate, and loud enough to be heard by half the room. "I wanted to thank you personally." Arlyn stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. She took his hand, unsure whether the room had gone completely silent or if she'd just stopped processing sound. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said carefully. He smiled, not unkindly. "I wasn't planning to attend, but when I heard this event was open to guests and you'd be here, I thought it was time you were acknowledged." The pause that followed rippled across the ballroom like a dropped glass that never quite hit the floor. People turned in their seats. Some squinted. A few murmured. Judge Marsh turned to face the room fully. "For those of you who don't know," he said, "Ms. Keswick's work was instrumental in saving a federal case that was on the verge of collapse. Her analysis uncovered a deception pattern that neither prosecution nor defense identified. Without her insight, the case would have been dismissed wrongfully and with consequences that could have reverberated through multiple government contracts and public institutions." No one breathed. Her contribution, he continued, was confidential at the time. but the ruling has since been made public. I felt it was long overdue for someone to say clearly and without qualification her work mattered. It changed the outcome. It upheld justice. Arlyn blinked. Her mouth was dry. She could feel every eye in the room. Judge Marsh offered her a final nod. You have my respect, Miss Keswick, and the respect of a court that knows what it owes you. Then, as quickly as he came, he turned and walked out. No fanfare, no handshake tour, just a single seismic disruption in the middle of an otherwise controlled evening. Arlyn stood frozen for a moment, hands at her sides, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Then, slowly, mechanically, she sat. The silence stretched another beat. Then, silverware clinking, a scattered cough. Someone whispered, "What just happened?" Gregory looked at her as if he were seeing a stranger. Irene's mouth was slightly open wineglass suspended mid-sip. Celia looked pale, not embarrassed, not annoyed, just stunned, as if the rules of the story she'd always told about her family had suddenly been rewritten. The florist at Arlyn's table leaned in. "You're that Arlyn Keswick?" She nodded once. "Holy hell," the woman whispered. The rest of the table stared wide-eyed. No one spoke. Arlyn picked up her wineglass, now mostly warm, and took a sip. Her hands were steady. At the head table, Celia sat with her shoulders just slightly stiff. Irene whispered something in her ear. Celia didn't respond. Gregory was still staring at Arlyn. "Federal judge," he said aloud to no one in particular. "Deception analysis." Irene, finally finding her voice, turned toward Gregory. "Did you know she did anything like that? She said she was consulting." Gregory muttered, "But not like this. Not federal cases. Not Greg." Celia's voice was quiet, but firm. She didn't say because we didn't ask. He didn't respond. Arlyn checked her phone. A new message from Wesley had popped up a minute after Marsh left. "Wesley Drohan. Told you one room would figure it out eventually." "Nice timing, huh?" Arlyn let a smile rise at the corners of her mouth. She looked up again. The air had shifted. Her world, the sealed, quiet one, had cracked open just enough for the rest of them to peek inside. They would go back to their conversations. Eventually. They would talk about Celia's speech, the food, the wine, but none of them would forget the moment the judge walked past the star of the evening and stopped at table 6. Stopped for her. The woman no one could quite place. The one who finally stopped hiding without saying a single word. Gregory's fork clattered against his plate, a sharp metallic sound that sliced cleanly through the stunned quiet. It wasn't the kind of startled noise that came from surprise. It was the drop of something slipping from a hand, too slow to hold what it never expected to grasp. Irene gasped sharp, involuntary, and her napkin fluttered from her lap like it too couldn't bear the weight of the moment. Her gaze flicked to Arlyn, then to the doors where Judge Marsh had exited, then back to her daughter as if trying to reconcile two separate people in one body. The Arlyn she had shaped from polite expectations and the Arlyn who had just been publicly thanked by a federal judge in front of Charleston's finest. Celia hadn't moved. Not at first. Her eyes remained on Arlyn with the disbelieving intensity of someone who just realized they've been reading the wrong chapter for years. The confident posture she maintained throughout the evening, one shoulder angled, just so the perfectly timed glances and gracious smiles fractured. Her jaw tightened, not from anger, but from something older, heavier. Something that looked like fear dressed in confusion. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. Across the room, conversation had stuttered back to life in uneven bursts. Not full recovery, just pockets of whispering quick glances, speculative murmurs. Judge Marsh hadn't lingered. His message was clear, deliberate, and final. There was nothing left to clarify. He'd said her name. He'd praised her work, and then he left because his business wasn't with the room, it was with Arlyn. At table 6, no one reached for dessert. Someone asked for more water, but even the server looked rattled. Gregory cleared his throat twice. "Federal," he muttered. Federal. He looked directly at Arlyn now, the way a man might regard a safe he'd owned for decades, only to realize something had been locked inside it the entire time. You never mentioned anything like that. Arlyn set her wine glass down gently. I did. You just didn't ask the second time? Irene blinked. But that judge, he said national contracts deception analysis. What on earth have you been doing? Working, Arlyn said, her voice calm. A lot. Irene's fingers fluttered at her chest. But you never said it was important. I said it mattered to me. Celia stood. Abruptly. The legs of her chair scraped across the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. Her gaze was locked on Arlyn, not with rage, not even with jealousy, but something far more destabilizing realization. You told me once you weren't ambitious, Celia said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. That you liked being in the background. I never said that, Arlyn replied, holding her gaze. You said it. I just stopped correcting you. Celia's mouth opened, then closed again. She sat back down slower this time, her expression unreadable. Across the room near the bar, Wesley stood. He wore a soft gray suit and an expression that could have been mistaken for casual if not for the slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. When Arlyn looked up, he raised his glass to her in a slow, deliberate toast, not mocking, not performative, just recognition, quiet and exact. Arlyn's throat tightened. She lifted her own glass slightly in response, the gesture, small, almost imperceptible. Her fingers brushed the rim steady despite the rush of heat climbing up her chest. She hadn't known he was coming, but of course he was. Wesley didn't like unfinished business. The room had returned to its natural rhythm, or tried to. Dessert plates clinked. Waiters resumed their silent choreography. Someone asked Celia about her keynote in D.C. next month, and Irene smiled too brightly at the woman beside her. But nothing felt the same. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. The girl at table 6, the one in the plain black dress no one could quite place, had just been publicly saluted by a man whose name was etched into federal opinions and legal precedents. And not for being related to someone successful. Not for being part of someone else's story, but for her own work. Work they hadn't even bothered to imagine she was capable of. Gregory reached for his water, then stopped. You've worked with the DOJ, he asked more to himself than to her. And the judge said, deception patterns. Arlyn turned toward him. I analyze speech, behavioral language. I look for inconsistencies, things that slip when people lie. It's not always about what they say, it's how. Gregory stared. So you're some kind of profiler? Sort of, she said, just not the kind that carries a gun. There was a long pause. Then, and all this time you let us think. I didn't let you. Arlyn interrupted gently. You never asked past the first sentence. Gregory leaned back slowly and for once said nothing. The podiatrist at Arlyn's table whispered something to her daughter, who looked at Arlyn with the wide-eyed awe usually reserved for celebrities. The florist next to her murmured, That was the most satisfying thing I've seen all year. Arlyn smiled faintly but didn't reply. She felt Wesley's eyes on her again, and for a moment the weight of the years, the dismissals, the birthday dinners with forced smiles, the polite head tilts when she tried to explain what she did, it all started to melt. Not because they understood. Not yet. But because they couldn't ignore her anymore. Celia didn't speak again. But as Arlyn returned to her seat and folded her napkin into her lap, their eyes met across the room. For the first time in 30 years, her sister didn't look past her. She looked at her. The ballroom emptied slowly like the end of a play where no one knew whether to clap again or just gather their coats. People drifted toward the exit, still buzzing quietly about Judge Marsh's surprise appearance. Arlyn caught bits of conversation as she moved through the corridor, fragments of her name said with new weight. Irene had insisted on riding together. It's a family night, she'd said earlier with her practiced smile. Now she was gripping her clutch tightly, waiting at the valet stand with Gregory and Celia, her heels planted as if trying to steady herself against the subtle tremor in the air. The silence between them was stiff brittle. Celia kept her eyes forward. Gregory was scrolling through his phone as if searching for a headline that would make sense of the evening. Arlyn stood slightly apart. Arms crossed, the chill of the Charleston night brushing over her collarbone. She hadn't brought a coat. She hadn't expected to stay this long. Their car arrived, a dark sedan Gregory insisted on renting for occasions. He opened the back door without looking at anyone. Irene slid in first. Celia followed. Arlyn hesitated for half a second, then stepped in and closed the door behind her. They pulled away from the curb in silence. The driver didn't speak. No one did. The city lights flickered past in rhythm with the passing seconds, stoplight red, storefront gold, the occasional flicker of neon from a late-night diner. Inside the car, it felt like a pressure chamber, every breath measured. Finally, Irene turned from the front passenger seat. Her voice was quieter than usual. Not sharp, not dismissive, just uncertain. "Arlyn," she said slowly, "what is it you actually do?" Arlyn met her mother's eyes in the rearview mirror. There was no sarcasm there, no Polish. Just a woman realizing she had lived for years in a house with a daughter she'd never truly seen. "I listen to people who lie for a living," Arlyn said. Her tone was calm, precise. "And I help stop them from hurting others." The sentence landed like a chord played on a piano no one realized was in the room. Irene blinked, her lips parting slightly. Gregory turned from his phone. Even Celia shifted, just barely, her eyes flicking sideways. "I don't work in one place," Arlyn continued. "I work on cases, some government, some corporate. Most are classified or too sensitive to talk about. I look for patterns in speech, in stories, in behaviors. My job is to notice what others miss." There was no apology in her voice, no attempt to soften the edges for their comfort. "That judge," Irene murmured. "He said you saved a case." "I helped identify a leak that would have compromised national contracts," Arlyn replied. "There were consequences." The case almost unraveled. "They called me in late. It wasn't my job to fix it, but I did what I could." Irene stared out the window. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" Arlyn looked forward. The dashboard clock glowed 10:47. "Because the first time I tried," she said evenly, "you asked if it was a real job. The second time, you asked if I had considered getting a teaching credential instead. And the third time, you changed the subject to Celia's podcast interview." Silence. She didn't say it with anger, just memory. In the quiet that followed, Celia finally spoke. Her voice wasn't confrontational. It was soft tentative. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Arlyn turned to her sister. Celia's hands were folded in her lap, thumbs pressed tightly together. "Would you have heard me if I did?" Arlyn asked gently. Celia flinched, just barely, but she didn't deny it. The car turned down their childhood street, lined with dogwoods and manicured hedges, the neighborhood that had once seemed so vast and important. Arlyn hadn't been back here in months. Years, maybe not really counting. "I thought you were drifting," Irene said suddenly. Her voice was brittle but honest. "I thought you didn't know what you were doing with your life." "I knew exactly what I was doing," Arlyn said. "I just stopped explaining it to people who had already decided it didn't count." No one replied. The driver pulled up in front of the house. Gregory got out first, muttering something about needing a drink. Irene followed, moving slower than usual. Celia lingered. When Arlyn stepped out, Celia caught her by the arm fingers, cool against her skin. "Was I that dismissive?" she asked. Arlyn looked at her. "You weren't cruel," she said. "You just never thought I had anything worth knowing." Celia let her hand drop. "I didn't mean to be that person, I know." They stood together for a moment on the walkway, the porch light glowing above them, casting long shadows behind their feet. The air smelled like jasmine and night. Celia wrapped her arms around herself. "That judge, he didn't come to see me. He came for you." Arlyn nodded. "He did." Celia let out a slow breath. "I'm not used to being the one who gets passed over." Arlyn didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some shifts don't need commentary, they just need time. She gave her sister a quiet nod and walked toward her own car parked 2 houses down. As she reached for the door handle, her phone buzzed. Wesley Drohan. That was a hell of a thing, Keswick. She didn't respond. Not yet. But a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as she drove off into the night, this time carrying nothing she needed to hide. Celia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft hum of the central air, the only sound in the dark. The award pin sat on her dresser, still clipped to the lapel of her gala dress. Her phone buzzed twice, texts from colleagues, no doubt. Congratulations. Applause, emojis, one-liners about her speech. She didn't check them. The judge's voice still echoed in her head. Her work saved an entire case from collapse. Her insight was critical to the outcome. But it wasn't her name, he said. It was Arlyn's. Celia turned on her side and pressed her forehead against the cool linen pillow. She hadn't touched dessert. After the judge left, she couldn't taste anything, couldn't feel her hands, couldn't even look at her sister without something shifting painfully beneath her ribs. Arlyn hadn't gloated. That would have been easier. Arlyn had just stood there dignified and calm, like she wasn't shocked at all that a federal judge had shown up at her table. Like she belonged there. Celia had spent years assuming Arlyn liked being small, quiet, invisible. She wore flats to family events and never interrupted. She showed up to birthdays late and left early. Her job, vague and drifting, was easy to dismiss. She never needed applause, never asked for recognition. So Celia had decided Arlyn didn't want any. But now she wasn't so sure. She rolled onto her back again, staring up into the dark. The house was silent. Gregory had gone to his study hours ago. Irene hadn't said much when they got home, just poured herself a glass of wine and disappeared upstairs. Celia reached toward the nightstand and picked up an old leather journal she hadn't touched in years. Flipping through it, she found a line she'd written down during sophomore year from her psych professor, a wiry man with too many cardigans and a tendency to stare too long at ceiling tiles mid-lecture. Brilliance comes in many forms, he'd said that day. Some people are storms, others are gravity. Some burn loud and some burn quiet, but make no mistake, they still burn. She had written it down without really thinking. She'd always assumed she was the storm in that metaphor. Celia closed the journal slowly. She'd spent so long defining herself by contrast. The doctor, the achiever, the one who had a plan, who followed it, who won. It wasn't just a role, it was a currency. People called her the successful one with such reverence that it began to feel like a permanent title. At first, it had been about making her parents proud. Then it became about proving something to herself. Eventually, it just became habit. And part of that habit was being Arlyn's opposite, the reliable one, the focused one, the one who didn't stray from the path. But tonight, for the first time, that structure cracked. Because someone from the outside, a federal judge no less, had acknowledged Arlyn not as her sister, not as the family mystery, but as a peer, worse, as someone who had done something Celia never could, saved something that couldn't be sutured with surgical skill. Arlyn's intelligence wasn't loud, but it had consequence. Celia had spent her life being visible. But visibility, she now realized, wasn't the same as value. That thought made her chest ache. She remembered a moment years ago, maybe during her residency, when she'd passed Arlyn reading at the kitchen table. It was late. Arlyn had been home visiting. She'd been hunched over pages of text headphones and completely focused. Celia hadn't even asked what it was. She'd assumed it was some hobby, a project that would never really lead anywhere. Now, she wondered what Arlyn had been working on, who she'd been helping, what world she'd been shaping in silence. Celia sat up and walked to the dresser, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She unclipped the pin from her blazer and set it beside her jewelry tray. It gleamed under the dim glow of the hallway light. It still meant something. It wasn't fake, but it didn't feel quite as full as it had before. She thought of the way the judge had looked at Arlyn. With respect, yes, but also with certainty. He hadn't been surprised she was capable. He'd expected it. That was what gutted Celia most, that someone outside their family had already known. She hadn't even bothered to ask. Celia leaned forward, resting her palms against the dresser. Her reflection stared back from the mirror. Hair pinned back, makeup smudged, but eyes wide open. She whispered as if afraid someone might hear I didn't know, and maybe that was the problem. She never thought she had to. It was nearly 8 p.m. when Arlyn heard the knock. Not the heavy thud of a delivery driver or the rapid tap of a neighbor needing something, but a measured, hesitant knock, like someone unsure if they had the right door. She rose from the couch, still wearing the same hoodie and joggers she'd changed into after her run. The day had been uneventful by design, quiet coffee, a little reading, then slowly working her way through a backlog of case notes. After the gala, she'd needed stillness, distance. But when she opened the door, still tying her hair into a knot, she froze. Celia. Hair pulled back in a simple braid. No makeup. A jacket too thin for the chill outside. In her hands, a brown paper bag, the kind boutique shops use with something heavy inside. Arlyn blinked. You lost. Celia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not anymore. There was a beat. Then Arlyn stepped aside just enough for her sister to enter. Celia paused in the doorway as if crossing a threshold she wasn't sure she'd be allowed back through. Arlyn's apartment was modest, but clean books stacked on side tables, a candle burning low on the counter, and a bulletin board in the corner with articles pinned at odd angles crisscrossed with string. The space was lived in. Grounded. Real. Celia held out the bag. I brought something. Arlyn took it with cautious hands and peeked inside. A leather-bound notebook, slim black, the kind with thick ivory pages and a cloth bookmark stitched into the spine. You used to write in these all the time, Celia said. I found one in the attic. I didn't read it. I just remembered. Arlyn brushed her fingers across the cover. It was nearly identical to the journal she'd filled as a teenager, quietly documenting thoughts, too sharp or strange to share. She set it gently on the coffee table and motioned to the armchair. Sit if you want. Celia did. They sat in silence for nearly a minute. Not awkward, just suspended, as if the room needed to adjust to holding both of them. I don't know how to do this, Celia said, eventually her voice low. Arlyn leaned back, watching her sister with unreadable eyes. Start with why you're here. Celia exhaled. Because last night cracked something open in me and I can't go back to pretending it didn't. She glanced around the apartment again, her fingers twisted in her lap. I've spent most of my life needing to win, she admitted. Not out of ego, not really. More like fear. If I wasn't exceptional, I didn't know who I was, and I defined myself by being the one who succeeded while you... Her voice faltered. While you floated. Arlyn raised an eyebrow. Floated, I told myself that, Celia said quickly. That you didn't want more, that you weren't trying. It made me feel safer. She looked down. But that judge, he didn't talk like you were floating. He talked like you were holding the entire thing together while the rest of us had no idea. Arlyn didn't speak. Celia pressed on. I didn't want to believe you had value I couldn't measure. That your worth wasn't obvious or branded or published. It scared me. A long silence followed. Then Arlyn said calmly, You always needed to win. I just needed to survive. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Celia flinched slightly. That's fair. I know. I never saw it that way, Celia said. I thought we were both fighting for the same thing. Arlyn shook her head. No. You were fighting for attention. I was fighting to exist without having to ask for it. Celia looked over, and for the first time in years, there was no competition in her gaze. Just sorrow and something close to awe. I'm sorry, she said, voice barely above a whisper, for ignoring you, for defining you by what you weren't, for assuming quiet meant small. Arlyn's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed steady. I never needed you to make me loud. I just needed you to stop pretending I wasn't there. Celia nodded slowly. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, then faded. You don't have to forgive me tonight, Celia said, or ever. I just needed you to know I'm not proud of how long it took me to see you, but I do see you now. Arlyn looked down at the notebook. Her thumb traced the stitching along the spine. You kept this kind of gift for someone you respected, she murmured. I do. For a long time, neither moved. Then Arlyn stood and walked to the kitchen. She pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, filled them with water, and popped them into the microwave. When the timer beeped, she dropped tea bags into each and carried them back into the living room. She handed one to Celia. They sat again. No more words. Just two sisters side by side, the steam rising slowly between them. Some reckonings come with screaming. Others arrive in the quiet, long overdue and finally heard. The restaurant was small, tucked between a used bookstore and an old tailor's shop on a quiet street Arlyn hadn't walked in years. It wasn't one of the downtown spots Celia usually favored. No white linen, no wall of wine bottles, no hostess with a clipboard and an earpiece, just warm, lighting-worn brick walls and the smell of something roasted and slow-cooked. Arlyn arrived first, scanning the room until she saw Celia, already seated at a corner table tucked behind a half-wall draped in ivy. The sight struck her as strange, not the fact that Celia had invited her, but that she had chosen this place. Unpolished, humble, private. Arlyn approached slowly. Celia stood to greet her with a tentative smile. "Hey! Hey!" Arlyn echoed, sliding into the seat across from her. They both reached for the menus like shields. The server approached and took their drink orders, iced tea for Arlyn Pinot Noir for Celia, then disappeared again, leaving behind the delicate tension of two people trying to relearn each other. "I haven't been here since med school," Celia said, looking around. "Used to come with a study group. We thought we were so intellectual for ordering lamb shank and talking about patient ethics." Arlyn smiled faintly. "I always imagined your study groups met in lecture halls and judged each other's handwriting." Celia laughed a real unguarded sound. Some of them did. Their appetizers came quickly roasted carrots with harissa yogurt, warm sourdough with honey butter. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, letting the act of sharing food soften the edges of what still hung between them. Celia set down her fork. "I know last week was a lot." Arlyn raised an eyebrow. "You mean the part where a federal judge thanked me in front of 200 people and the ceiling didn't collapse?" Celia winced. "Yea, that part." They both chuckled, and the weight in the air eased, if only slightly. "I wanted this dinner to be just us," Celia said after a moment. "No Mom, no Gregory, no stage, I wanted to know you without the noise." Arlyn studied her sister for a long moment. "That's new." Celia nodded. "So is being humbled in public." They paused again as their entrees arrived, grilled trout for Arlyn, mushroom risotto for Celia. Arlyn picked at her food for a beat, then said, "I wasn't hiding from you, you know?" "I know," Celia said. "I was hiding from the idea that you might be more than I allowed myself to believe." They both sat with that for a moment. "Your world is like another planet," Celia said softly. "The way you see people, read them, track truth in things the rest of us would overlook. I didn't realize how small mine is." Arlyn shook her head gently. "Yours isn't small, Celia. It's just visible, tangible, lives saved, titles earned, you're measurable, people like measurable. But you," Celia leaned forward, voice hushed. "You sit in silence and reshape the outcome of entire cases without anyone seeing your face. That kind of impact, I wasn't ready to understand it." Arlyn stirred her tea. "Mine just doesn't come with a podium. That doesn't make it less real." Celia looked down, then up again. "Do you ever miss it? The spotlight?" "I never had it," Arlyn replied. "You can't miss what was never offered, but yes. Sometimes I miss being invited into the story. Not to take over, just to be acknowledged." Celia set down her fork and exhaled. "I think I was so afraid of losing my space in the story that I didn't notice you never had one." That landed. Arlyn watched her for a while. Then, softly, "Why now?" Celia met her gaze. "Because I don't want to be someone who only makes space for others once she's been forced to." They sat in stillness again, but this time it felt earned. Then, out of nowhere, Celia said, "Do you remember that time in high school when I sprained my ankle before the debate finals and Mom made me go anyway?" Arlyn blinked. "You mean when you iced it during lunch with a bag of frozen corn and limped onto the stage anyway?" Celia grinned. "Yeah. You came with me, sat in the back with extra water bottles and told me my blazer looked like a senator's." Arlyn chuckled. "It did. Like a junior senator from Vermont." Celia smiled wider. "I think that's the last time I really heard you. Before life became about proving things." Arlyn stirred the ice in her tea. "I never stopped watching you, even when you stopped looking back." Celia reached across the table and rested her fingers gently near Arlyn's, not quite a touch, but close. "I don't want to keep doing that," she said. "I don't want to look through you anymore." Arlyn didn't move, but she didn't pull away either. "Then don't," she said quietly. The check came. Celia reached for it. "You sure Arlyn asked?" "For now," Celia said. "Next time you pick the place." Arlyn smirked. "I'm taking you to a diner with burnt coffee and a waitress named Dot." Celia laughed. "Sounds perfect." They stepped into the night, the crisp air wrapping around them like something fresh and unfinished. For the first time in a long time, the space between them felt like possibility. And not distance. The lecture hall wasn't glamorous, just rows of tiered seats and a whiteboard behind a quiet podium. But Arlyn stood there with the confidence of someone who didn't need glamour to be heard. Her name was on the projector screen behind her, Arlyn Keswick, guest lecturer, behavioral linguistics. In the back row, hidden behind a column, Celia sat quietly. She hadn't told Arlyn she was coming. She wasn't sure she'd stay, but something in her needed to see her sister in her element, not at a dinner table, not in the shadow of their parents' praise, but here. Arlyn's voice was steady as she spoke. When people lie, they try to control not just facts, but how they're remembered. The trick is listening for what they avoid. Celia watched the grad students, faculty leaning forward, engaged. Arlyn didn't perform. She guided. She taught with purpose, ease, and clarity. Celia realized she'd never actually seen Arlyn speak like this, not as her sister. As a professional, as an expert, no spotlight, no applause cues, and yet the room was undeniably hers. The lecture ended with a few questions. Arlyn answered them directly, thoughtfully. One student asked if it ever felt frustrating doing work that was often classified, uncredited. Arlyn smiled slightly. "Recognition isn't the same as impact. I care about the second more." The audience clapped politely, rising in small groups. Celia stood too heart-tight. She didn't go to the front, didn't linger. Instead, she slipped out the side door, and on her way, she left a folded note on Arlyn's podium. 10 minutes later, as Arlyn packed up, she spotted the slip of paper tucked beneath her notebook. She opened it slowly. "I finally see it. You didn't need a room to clap for you, but I'm clapping anyway." Arlyn read it twice, then once more. She folded it carefully and slid it into her pocket. A quiet smile rose to her face, steady deep. Because sometimes the loudest applause comes not from a room full of people, but from the silence finally breaking.